The engine of the GTO is back, and I'm going to show you all the upgrades that have been done and all the upgrades I'll be putting into this engine when I put it back together on this episode of Josh's Car Corner. So here's the short block all back together in its new glory, back from its visit to Larry's Engine and Marine in Tucson, Arizona. I had them take the whole thing apart, take the rotating assembly out of it, inspect everything. They cleaned the block thoroughly to make sure there's no metal left laying around in there. And I had them replace anything that needed replacing. And once they took it apart and started inspecting it, they did discover that the pistons were starting to get worn out. The side skirts in particular, there's a coating on them that's supposed to help with friction and wear, and that coating was starting to wear off. And they also showed me some places on the undersides of the piston where they were starting to get a little bit cooked. And after 138,000 miles and the way I have beat this thing on track days and at the drag strip and just having fun on a weekend, it was probably time to just upgrade everything. So what we've got is the original block. What they did is they decked the block 5/1000ths of an inch just to clean everything up on the mating surface. The crank is still the same, although they inspected it and made sure it was all in good condition, and it was. It just needed new bearings, so it got all new bearings. What they did do, and I'll show you as I unwrap this thing, what the new hotness is in these cylinder bores. Oh, I love the smell of assembly lube in the morning. So what you can see here is, looking at these pistons, especially this one right here, these are not the factory pistons. Everything has been upgraded. This is a Wiseco forged piston, and as you can see, it's got some valve reliefs cut in it for a very good reason, because this is actually a domed piston. I was looking at what different pistons I could use to achieve the goals I wanted to get, and there were actually not a whole lot of choices off the shelf that I had available to me. After doing a little math, I figured out that these will work for me. So this piston, you can see here, got these deep valve reliefs cut into it too, and there's also even a relief cut in for the spark plug. That's how big this dome is. It's actually a 9cc dome, and if you combine that with everything on an all factory build, you end up with about 12-to-1 compression, which is a lot, especially on pump gas. Now most of the time I'm going to be running on E55, so there it's not going to be a big deal at all. But if I ever want to take this thing on a drive and all I have available to me is 91 octane, then it's going to be a little tricky. But there are some things I can do about that. Now what you can't see underneath is the connecting rods for it as well. The factory ones are gone just because they wouldn't work with these pistons. I needed to get something else. So the only thing I could get that wasn't a heavy H-beam that was way overbuilt for what my goals are is a Scat I-beam. Now the factory rods are a 6098 length from center to center on the journals. These are a 6/100, so they're 2/1000ths of an inch longer. I mean, it's so little you couldn't even notice, but they are a little bit longer, and math does factor into things, and I'm going to go over all that math later to help me decide how I wanted to build this thing, and hopefully help you understand a little bit the math that goes into building engines. So that's all the upgrades that have been done to the block, but now I have to start putting things back on it. Alright, now it's time to put in the camshaft, and here is the brand new unit from Comp. I didn't go to the trouble of speccing one out myself. Well, actually, I was going to at first, and then I found, after searching through their entire catalog, out of 125 cams for the LS, I actually found this one that was 95 to 100% what I wanted, so I just got it. So it's an off-the-shelf model. It's their XE273 HR cam. Now this is about as aggressive a cam as you would want to go in a street motor. To go much beyond this, you're going to start getting into valve overlap, and then you're going to start really dropping off on fuel economy, and you're probably not going to meet emissions too, because you'll be sucking a raw fuel mixture right out the exhaust, and that's never going to pass EPA. So the specs on this one are 224 intake, 230 on the exhaust at 50,000ths lift, and we've got 581 lift on the intake and 592 lift on the exhaust. It's still got that same 114 lobe separation angle that I had on the old cam, so it should have a nice idle with a little bit of bite to it, and it should still make that beautiful, nice arcing power band, but with a little bit more meat on the top. So this will be a great cam to go with the heads and the intake I have coming too. So I'll get this pulled out here, and I got my Lucas Assembly lube right here. I had to just go pick this up and get everything lubed up here, and we'll get this puppy slid in. Now if you go back to episode 26 of the show, where my buddy Joe and I put the new camshaft in his G8, you would have seen us do this. Not very well, because I didn't frame the shot up very well, but with this, you want to just take assembly lube and you want to just coat everything thoroughly. And you want to use assembly lube. Don't use motor oil to do this. Assembly lube is a very, very sticky lubricant. It will stick to the metal, so this can sit in the block for weeks, maybe even months, and the lubrication's not going to come off. And that is what you want for your initial fire up, because even if you can prime the block, which is hard to do on an LS motor because there aren't a lot of tools that allow you to do it, there are methods to sort of pseudo prime the block so the whole thing has got oil in the system and is ready to build pressure when it's time to fire it up, but it's not foolproof. So you definitely want to use this stuff to make sure everything is lubricated for that initial fire up. Until pressure is built, this lubrication will stick around and will not come off of the lobes and the journals before you fire it up, to make sure everything is nice and wet and ready to go. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to go to about halfway down. So you got 5 main lobe journals that hold the camshaft in place. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to do up to the 3rd one with assembly lube. Then, just to make sure I'm not making a huge mess, I'm going to start putting the camshaft into the block, and once it's in there, I'll just keep lubing things as I go. Okay, so I've got the first lobe inserted into the block here, and I'm just going to start feeding the camshaft in. And you just have to try to keep it as straight as possible, and it'll slide right into the next one. And the good thing is, because it's all apart like this, I can actually see where the next lobe has to go inside, and that makes installing it all that much easier. Just go nice and easy and don't ding it. So just go very, very slow. So that's the 3rd one. That's where I stopped. So now I'm going to continue with my assembly lube and keep applying it to everything here, and just make sure I touch everything. And it's okay to spin it when it's in the block like this, because it's lubricated, and actually, if anything, what you'll do is you'll take that assembly lube and you'll spread it on your cam bearings too, to make sure they get lubricated as well. If a spot feels a little dry to you, don't be afraid to apply more. You cannot use too much of this. It's important to make sure everything is as coated as it can be. Now remember where I said earlier it's good that I have the backside open to me, because this is where I'm having a bit of difficulty. I'm having trouble getting that back lobe lined up for the next one, so I should be able to stick my finger in the hole and assist it in getting lined up. Yeah, I can see it in there. Get my finger in there. Or at the very least, I can see where it's got to go. And just try to orient it there. There we go. It's in. That is one of the good reasons to do it this way. There it is. And there she is. So that is in. So now the next step is going to be to put the block off plate on there, because I can't put the timing set in until that's on. So I'm going to go get the block off plate and the Torx bolts, and we'll put that in next. Okay, now is going to be the start of a lot of 18 foot-pound torque specs. So the first thing you need to put on is this cam hold down plate. So this keeps the cam from walking forward and out of the block. You can put a little bit of assembly lube on this if you want. It will rub against it slightly, but there will be plenty of oil pressure there to hold it in place, and it's not an important wear piece. For peace of mind, if you want to do a little bit, that's fine. Now, this only goes on one way. The holes are beveled to accommodate these shouldered bolts that also center it as well as hold it in. And only use the factory bolts for this. If you lost them, get new ones. So this guy goes on right there like that, and these get torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. So I got my torque wrench set up. I'm just gonna start them by hand, and then we'll get them all torqued up. Make sure your threads are contaminant free before you do this. You don't want to hit 18 foot-pounds before you're actually there, and you can if you've got crap in the threads. It can create artificial resistance, and then you're not hitting the right tight point when you torque down your bolts. Now, if you saw the way that I did that, I kind of half tightened these two first, and then I tightened these until they clicked. Then I came back and did these. It just helps to make sure that thing is absolutely centered on there when you go to final torque it down. And torque specs on these aluminum blocks are incredibly important. You want to make sure that you're doing everything as accurately as you can. Don't just snug these up by hand, because it's aluminum, it flexes and moves more, and you wouldn't think it, but just torquing down components can actually change the shape of things. In fact, when they line hone the block for the crank most times, they'll bolt on the oil pump to simulate the torque of the bolts holding the oil pump on, because it will actually change the shape of the front journal just that little bit. And you want to simulate what it's going to actually be when you put it together. So all that stuff, very important when you do this. Now that I've got that done, I can get the cam gear out and we can get that lined up, and the new chain and the new tensioner, and put that on, and then we've got the timing set in, and that part is done. Okay, so now I'm to the point where I want to find top dead center on cylinder number 1, and I've gotten a little more sophisticated than I did when we did the cam 5 years ago, where we're just lining dots up. I actually picked up this dial gauge so you can precisely measure things. I'm going to need this for a couple of different processes when I'm putting the engine back together. But one of the funny things is when it's got a magnetic base, and when you're trying to use it on an aluminum block, that can get tricky. So in order to hold this thing in place right now, that plate that it's sitting on is actually the shim plate that goes behind the slave cylinder for the clutch. So that's just kind of held in place, but that's enough because the spring on this thing is so sensitive, you can actually turn it and it won't lift the whole mechanism off the plate, and you can get an accurate measurement. And I'm not looking for any measurement in distance. Where I'm looking for is the place where the needle stops climbing and stays in place. That will tell me when I'm precisely at top dead center, which is where I want to leave it when I start putting the chain on and the gear on and all that stuff. So, now what's cool about these dial gauges is you can take the whole face of the gauge and rotate it to where your starting point is. So I turned it so it's zeroed out right now. That's not really crucial, but it's nice to just start from a known 0 point when you're doing this. So I just got to do a complete revolution of the engine here and bring it back up. And now the piston's coming back up. And that's going to be too much. There we go. Now, here's what will happen. So you'll watch, it'll hit the gauge, and it'll start to slowly go up. So where I'm looking for is the point where it stops. That is top dead center exactly. So 59, a little past 59. Okay, it stopped right there. So that point right there is precisely top dead center. And yeah, the dot is pointing straight up, but you've got no reference in here to know that you're pointing exactly straight up. So now I know I'm precisely on top dead center for number 1. So when I go and put the gear on and everything, I know it'll be perfectly lined up. Okay, now it's time to put the timing gear on. So what I had to do is just loosely attach it to the cam with the bolts, just to get it in roughly the right position. So the big dot is pointing at the little dot, so it's kind of roughed in place. Now I gotta take the gear back off, put my new chain on it. Going with a single whirler again, but this is not the LS2 timing gear, chain. This is actually the C5R racing timing chain. A little bit stronger, I mean, designed to run a 24-hour endurance race, so has to be pretty tough. Did not want to go with a double roller, don't like double rollers. I've seen way too many videos and pictures of double rollers failing. I don't really think they do anything else. It's more important to get the valve train moving as efficiently as possible rather than throwing a huge chain in it. That's not gonna solve your problems. If your valve train isn't operating cleanly, you're gonna snap chains no matter how big a chain you use. The other change I made is that instead of going with the LS2 timing chain damper block, I upgraded to the LS3 timing chain tensioner. I just think this is a better program because it gives you better control of the chain overall, because it's not always the problem when the engine is accelerating. It's also an issue when the engine is decelerating. So when the engine's accelerating, this part of the chain is tight because obviously the crank is pulling the cam to make it spin faster. But then when you're decelerating, obviously the cam's got some weight in it, it carries momentum, it also needs to decelerate, so when the engine's slowing down, now this part of the chain is tight. So with the old program in the damper block, one end is always going to be loose and flopping around. With this deal, both ends should be much better controlled, because once you've got this thing installed, you pull this clip right here and then the spring engages and it puts tension on the chain all the time. I think that's a much better program. Now, there were actually two versions of this. There was an early version where this composite material would actually dry up and get brittle and break. And then there's this revised version that does not have that problem. So this is the one that I'm going to go with. But you got to put this on first because it goes behind the chain. And it does come with new bolts. And these bolts, like everything else, get 18 foot-pounds. All right, so that's done. Now, you can put the chain on and the gear. Just got to kind of wiggle it and maneuver it around. Oh, I missed it. I'm one tooth advanced on the crank. With the tensor in here, it's a little fiddly to get this, but just be patient. So I'm still, there we go, I'll advance one gear there. Come on, baby. There we go, she's in. And she's lined up top to bottom. Everything's on. Okay, now I can put these bolts in. Now there's one difference here with these camshafts. These bolts do get more foot-pounds. Comp wants 26 foot-pounds on these bolts, because the last thing you would want is for these to back off and the cam gear to walk right off the camshaft. Not a good day. Having to help the bolt here. There's already so much tension being put on this chain by the tensioner with it being unsprung that I'm having to kind of wiggle and maneuver to make it hold it in place there. Okay. All right, perfect. So now that's in. Now there's one last thing I need to do here is just pull this guy. All right, I have a tension timing chain, so the whole timing system is in place, the cam's in. Okay, now it's time to put the front and the rear covers on, and this has always posed a little bit of an issue because these front and rear covers, they are bolted on, but they kind of have the ability to float around and move. And the thing is, the oil pan sits on both the front and the rear covers as well as the block. So when you put these front and rear covers on, they have to be on down here, they have to be flush with the block. And one question has always been for me is, how do you do that? Well, the easiest thing I've ever figured out to make sure that this is nice and flush is to just take the oil pan and put it back on without a gasket and just snug up the bolts in the four outside corners. You don't have to get them tight. You don't want to flex the aluminum. You just want to get it up there, and then you can press down on the cover when you're setting it in, and that'll make it flush. Now for the side-to-side positioning of it, the rear main seal should take care of that because it's strong enough to kind of center the plate on its own, but top to bottom gravity could pull it down a little bit and then make sure it's not centered. This is why you want to have the pan in there, just to make sure it's flush with the block. So I'll put that in, and now these seals, I'm also replacing the rear main right away because it was leaking a little bit, and if you're ever to this point, always change this. It's cheap, it's easy, it's just a little added protection. Now, you might ask yourself which way it goes in. It actually is marked in very small lettering on the outside. It says this side out on one side, and obviously that side should be facing out toward the away from the engine. And don't pull this out. This cap in here is designed so when you push the plate on, it keeps the seal from rolling back on itself. You want it to have the lips so they slide onto this and don't roll back, because if they roll back, it's not a seal, it's not going to do you any good. All right, that'll be enough to help center the covers in place. Now I'll go get the bolts and we'll put those on. So going back through all this hardware again, one thing I can tell you is that while the bolts for the oil pan and the front and rear engine cover all look the same. There actually is a difference. The rear engine cover bolts are just a hair shorter and they're also black. But the oil pan and the front engine cover bolts appear to be identical, so just a little thing. So what I'm doing right here is I've just got a coffee cup that I put some brake cleaner in, and I took all the bolts for the rear engine cover and I'm just shaking them around in here, trying to knock any loose dirt and crud out of the threads so they'll go in a little easier. And just doing that works, because look how much crud, let's see if you can see it, was in that. Yeah, that's just from shaking them. If you really wanted to go to the extreme, you could get out a wire brush and you could brush out all the threads. But because these were in the block, they should be fairly clean. The only times that they really should have picked up crud and contaminants in the threads is when you backed them out. So it shouldn't be in there all that tight. So for these particular bolts, I think doing this is pretty satisfactory. And it'll clean them up good enough for you. Where the bolts go themselves also has little rubber seals inside those. So don't jam these through as hard as you can. You probably want to rotate them in a little bit, just so the threads can pass them cleanly and you don't tear up the seals. If you get the top ones and the bottom ones in, that's enough to center the gasket on the plate. Then you can start to put it on the block. But you have to put it on straight. You can't put it on crooked because you want this thing to come out square. So you don't want to put one side on and then the other side on. You want to push it straight on. See how this works is, see this hole is cut in the middle? That slides right onto the crank snout. Then you push it straight back and this little thing pops out. And then you're ready to install. There we go. And I'm just going to double check it to make sure it didn't roll over. It did not. So now the only thing is, when I'm tightening these down, I'm going to make sure I push down on this so it stays flush with the bottom of the pan. Right, not a lot of pressure, just pushing down a little bit on this wrench, just a little bit to kind of make sure it stays down. And I'm not going to use this to finish tightening. I'm just going to get it started with this because you do have to torque all these to 18 foot-pounds. Okay, so there's one more thing I have to do before I'm done on the backside here, and I have to change out the pilot bearing. It's a good idea to do this anytime you're changing out things back here, just because it's what the input shaft of the transmission sits on, and you want that to be in good condition. It's a pretty cheap part, easy to replace. The only thing is, you might have seen on the internet that there are different kind of mechanic techniques that you can use in order to pop these things out. I've seen ones where they use grease and you pound it in there, and then just pounding the grease in forces the bearing out. You can do the same thing with bread, but you cannot do that on an LS crankshaft because it's actually gun drilled all the way through, and there's a freeze plug in there that actually caps it off and it keeps oil from getting out of the engine. So if you use that technique, you'll just pop the freeze plug out. You actually have to use a pilot bearing removal tool. Either make one up with some things you got at home, or you can go to your local parts store and rent one, take it back, costs you nothing. But that's the technique you have to use. So that's what I'm going to use to pull this bearing out quick. Okay, now it's time to work on the oil pan, and one of the things I have to do is take it apart and clean it very thoroughly because it's going to have metal particles floating around in it from when the lifter started disintegrating. So while I'm in here and changing things, I thought I'd show you some stuff. So you might have wondered on a GTO what this is right here. So the way the LS blocks work is all the oil pressure goes to the back quarter of the block first. So what this is for right here is the oil pressure comes straight from the pump through the block, then it comes down through here, and this is a transfer tube. What this is for is just to transfer the oil to the front of the pan where they mounted the oil filter pickup and connection. So it runs oil to the filter, the oil goes through the filter, comes back out and into the block. Now I have to take this out, one, to clean it thoroughly, to get all of the metal shavings out of there, but two, to get this plate off. You might see this section right here, and there's 6 bolt heads right here. This is the factory baffle for the bottom of the pan, and this comes out. And I need to take that out because, again, I need to clean it in there thoroughly, but for another reason that I'll show you once I take this apart. Now all of this, I've looked at this, you got 6 10mm bolts going around the baffle, and then you've got 4 more that you have to take off here. There's these two that are like captive nuts, so these threads should be attached to these nuts, so I should just be able to back these off and they go all the way through. Should take that out. And then there's two bolts here, and these are gasketed. I should not have to replace these gaskets, but if I do, I will tell you what part numbers they are. You'll have to take these out in order to take these pipes off, because they won't clear this vertical bar right here that's sticking up on the baffle. So we take these out, and make sure you don't lose the gaskets. There's a gasket on this side, a gasket on this side, and then there's a gasket over on this corner too. And they should all be exactly the same, just don't lose them. Okay. Okay, actually, these gaskets are two round gaskets to plug these pipes. The other one that was on the front here is just rectangular, so just for reference. Now, get out one of many cans of brake cleaner and start cleaning the bejesus out of this. Got to get all the oil clean out of this guy. Okay, now that I've got that crossover pipe out, I can take this baffle out, and then you can see what's really going on in the bottom of one of these oil pans. Okay, I got the pan all nice and cleaned out now, and I actually discovered something on the bottom side here when I was cleaning it. You might be able to see right here. This is all gashed and dug into right here. So obviously the oil pan was rubbing on something. So I went and looked at the engine bay to figure out what it was and see if it was rubbing on the subframe. No, what it was rubbing on is the power steering line that goes around and on the back of the cross member over to the rack. That has been rubbing. It's not being held in place very well, so I'm going to have to modify that in a way to pull it back. It's dug a significant amount in there. I still think there's enough aluminum there that it's not going to leak or anything, but that's not good. And of course the steel line has been dug into as well a little bit, so I could potentially have power steering leaks in the future. And now I'm starting to wonder if this is why so many people have reached out to me asking for power steering lines for the GTO that my parts guy has got. Wow, so definitely keep an eye on that, especially on your car. Could be happening. So here is the factory baffle. One, this is a very heavy unit. It's all made of steel, weighs a lot. Look at the underside here. The goal of this thing is to try to contain all of the oil in the bottom of the pan in this one space. This is where the pickup is for the pump. But it's not a great design. One, it weighs a lot, so it's extra weight you don't need to be carrying around. And two, it is not the best at baffling. There is an improved solution actually from a company called Improved Racing. This is their version of the baffle. For one thing, it has all kinds of trap doors. So the way these work is you've got these doors right here. These flip open. So when oil sloshing around, oil can get back in toward the pickup, but then when the oil wants to slosh back, the doors close and now it can't get back out. So it contains oil around the pickup a lot better. It weighs less than half of what this weighs. This probably weighs 3 or 4 pounds. This is all made of aluminum. This weighs less than a pound. So this is just more weight saved off the engine, and also aluminum does dissipate heat faster, so this will dissipate heat quicker and get it out into the pan and away from the oil. So I'm going to put this in its place, and it's a nice tight fit in there. I also have one other part from Improved Racing I'm going to be putting in once I get all this back together. So I can tell that this baffle also sits higher in the pan than the factory one does, because I see now why this is cut in here. It actually leaves a space for the crossover line to go. It makes room for it. So this sits up higher, so it means it can also trap more oil in the bottom than the factory baffle can, which is a good thing. So I'll start putting these guys back in. And they do have a place where the threads stop, so I would not try to really torque these hard because you could damage the threads in this thing. You just want to get them snug. The nuts that you put on the front side are going to do all the work with clamping force. That is one, and pardon the pun, Improved Racing oil pan. I'm also going to blow this out with my air compressor just to make sure there's absolutely no dust or particles in here too. But when it comes to torquing these down, they don't need a whole lot of torque. Probably only need 9 foot-pounds, just like the rear oil pan bolts do. Just because these gaskets are so thin, I would only go to 9 foot-pounds. Okay, so a couple more things, and I'm going to be ready to put this thing back on the engine stand and continue working on it. So right now I'm putting in the pilot bearing, and there's a couple of tech tips I want to give you for doing that. The first one is, when you get it, it's going to have two sides to it. One where the thing is together and you can see the inner section and the outer section. That part where you can see the two sections goes toward the motor. The smooth surface sticks to the outside. Now, second, to install it, a cheap and easy way to do it, you can take your drain plug. It fits in there perfectly, and the flare side with the built-in washer is the same diameter as the pilot bearing. So when you hit this, it's going to evenly spread the energy out to help that thing go in straight. Now, to ensure that it goes on straight, I was told by my engine guy, you can take some Scotch-Brite or some very fine sandpaper and just kind of give the back edge a little bit of a smoothing, just to kind of deburr it, and also just to get rid of that right angle that's on there and just kind of smooth that off. That helps to get it started. And then obviously apply some motor oil to it and to the cranks now, just to help with a little bit of lubricity. And then you can put this in here with an impact socket, and then just take a mallet and just very gently tap. Don't hit this hard, you don't need to slam it in 2 shots. Just take your time and go slow. Eventually it'll bottom out, and you can take this out and you'll see it bottomed all the way in the crank. And once it's that way, you're done. Okay, so I've got the flywheel on the back of the crank. Now, a couple things to remember here. First off, make sure that the surface of the crank is absolutely contaminant free. So wipe it down with a paper towel, maybe it's a little bit of brake cleaner out. Make sure you get all the dirt and grime and crap off of there. You don't want anything between the flywheel and the crank when you bolt this down. Next thing, make sure all the bolts go in before you get started. This thing only goes on one way, so make sure you've got it oriented the right way before you get started. Now, there are 3 torque stages for this. You need to, the first pass, they want you to do 15 foot-pounds, that's to help center it, and then second pass, 37 foot-pounds, kind of make sure it's centered more, and then final torque is 74 foot-pounds. Now, I would just go in a crisscross pattern like this, one side then the other, and then just kind of go around. So bing, bang, and then you can rotate this way or you can rotate this way. That doesn't matter as long as you're always across from the bolt you just did. And the last thing, and this is the most important thing, before you put these bolts in, red Loctite. Do not forget this. These things will vibrate and shudder. All of the energy in the crank ends up in these bolts, and you do not want these backing out. That happened to me a long time ago on my Grand Prix, and that's no fun because you have to take the whole thing back apart to put them back on and tighten them back on. Okay, now I'm ready to do the third pass, but by this point you are not going to be able to stop the engine from rotating around anymore, so that's where this guy is going to come in. This is a locking tool for the flywheel. It engages the ring gear here, and then will stop the whole motor turning. So my particular one goes in the starter bolt holes. So it goes in right here, and then just thread it in. It'll engage the piece right there and stop it. Then I can finish torquing, and I'm gonna need this later. The reason I'm putting the flywheel on now is because when it comes time to put in the bolt for the front harmonic balancer, that requires so much torque, you're gonna need something to hold the motor in place. You are not gonna be able to hold that in by hand. Even if the entire motor is together, you will turn it trying to tighten that bolt. Okay, that is done. Now it is time to get the engine back up on the stand so it'll be easier to work on. Okay, I've got my engine back on the stand here and I'm installing my new oil pump. What I did is I went ahead and got a Melling high pressure oil pump. This is the 10295 model. Now, people get confused as to whether you should get a high pressure pump or a high volume pump when they're building their engine. And I'll admit I got confused on this too until I actually got on their website and looked into it. In most cases, you want a high pressure oil pump because what that's going to do is it's going to keep the pressure higher at high RPM. Doesn't really affect idle RPM at all. That's pretty much the same. It's the bypass spring that controls the max pressure, and with these you get 3 different springs. There's a blue spring, which is the softest spring, which will limit the oil pressure this thing can put out to 60 psi. Now they come installed with a factory red spring, which limits max pressure to 70 psi. And if you want more than that, they also include a gray spring, which they call the Copo Camaro spring, because the Copo Camaros that GM built, the racing ones, those had a spring that would give you 75 psi of oil pressure. I'm just going to use the red one. If that 70 pounds of oil pressure is going to be fine for what I'm trying to do. Now, the other question is, when would you want a high volume oil pump? You would want a high volume oil pump in a situation where you open up your bearing clearances for your crank and your rods. Typically like a high boosted application where you're going to have that additional stress and that additional heat. Once the clearances are opened up, you need more volume to build the same amount of pressure. But in a motor like this, that's NA, and the clearances are all pretty much factory and still nice and tight, you don't need more volume, you just want more pressure. So that's why I went with the 10295 for this one, and I'm going to torque this thing down here, these 4 bolts, 18 foot-pounds. Then I got to put the pickup tube on, and I still got to clean it all out. But once I've done that, then I'll be ready to put this front cover on, and then I can get to the bottom of the engine, start getting that oil pan on. Okay, I've got the engine back in the air because I need to be able to rotate it for the next step. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is installing this new crank scraper that I got from Improved Racing, same company that made the new baffle that's going in the oil pan. Now what this does is it's going to ride really, really close to all the throws on the crankshaft, and as it's whipping around and that oil is on the crank throws, this is going to scrape them off, or scrape that oil off, so it'll get back down into the pan quicker, so the pan stays fuller and you have more oil in the pan available for use. And also, by pulling the oil off of the crankshaft, it frees up rotating inertia and can also increase horsepower a little bit. Not a lot, but you know, 1 or 2 horses. So what we have to do is I got to put this on. Now, they have wonderful instructions that come with this. Very detailed, all very nice. Explains in detail what you have to do to put this on, whether you're using the factory main studs or the ARP main studs. You can use either one. Because I'm using the factory main studs, what I have to do first is put this thing up on the bottom, and because the writing is on the outside, that goes on the bottom according to the instructions, and the writing also should go toward the front of the engine. Then I have to put in these reducer bushings, because this thing is drilled for ARP studs, which are bigger. You put these in for the corners, and that helps to center the thing and put it in place so it rubs everything correctly. And then I have to get a feeler gauge out and rotate the engine around and make sure I have appropriate clearance everywhere on the crank throws. You need a minimum of 20 thousandths clearance for this thing to work properly. What they really want is 40 thousandths clearance. So as long as I've got that, I'll be fine and I don't have to do anything. They say you can open this up a little bit if you have to make modifications for clearance. I shouldn't have to do that. I have a feeling this thing's going to go in and everything's going to be fine from the get-go. But I have to get under here and attach it and then spin the motor around with a feeler gauge and check my clearances. Okay, I'm under the engine with my feeler gauge here. We're going to start checking crank throws. So the places we're going to need to check are right along here on the side where the thing comes near the throw, and right here where it passes over on the edge. So just take my feeler gauge and, oh yeah, there's easily 20 thousandths there. Yep, and that moves really easily. We got 20 thousandths clearance there. Let's check this one. Oh yeah, we got 20 thousandths there, easy. Yep, got it on that side. Got it on that side. So yeah, so far it gets through everywhere, so that's good. That's good, that's good. Ooh, that's... This is 20 thousandths, but it's not much more than 20 thousandths. That one's a little snug. But 20 thousandths is the minimum, so they say as long as you got that, you're good. So we got that everywhere here. All in here. Yep, that's all good. All right, I'm gonna turn the motor just a little bit more. I think I'm gonna get out a bigger one just to see how snug that is. So the biggest this thing goes is 25 thousandths. All right, 25. 25, ooh, barely fits in there. So I think that says right there, we got 25 thousandths clearance. Now here, we easily got 25. So this is the tightest spot right here, and it's at 25, and 20 is what we need. So this thing is good. I can finish torque this down and double check it one more time, because this might warp a little bit when I torque down these bolts. But I'll check it one more time after that. As long as we're good, I can put the bottom part of this on. Okay, I've got the bottom part of the crank scraper on this tray right here, the windage tray. 6 bolts that hold this on the GTO, looks like, and only goes to 5 foot-pounds on these bolts, very small amount. You've got this little section right here to line it up. This is for where, if this was a rear sump car, this is where the dipstick tube would go, right here. But being front sump, it's up here, so this doesn't even interfere. But that is now all done. Okay, I've got the pickup tube on the engine now. Getting it up into the pump is tricky. So when you get these, you get 2 different O-rings to go with them, a green one and a black one. You need the black one for this pickup tube because it's straight. But even with that, it is fiddly to get it up there. You got to really twist, and you kind of got to ream to get it in there. But eventually it will pop in. And then this hole right here that also holds the windage tray and the scraper will also hold the pickup tube. So you just got to torque that down to 18 foot-pounds. And then the little bolt up here that attaches it to the pump, that only gets 9 foot-pounds. Okay, there's one more thing I'm going to do on this video before I wrap it up, and that is to put the oil pan back on. Now, pretty simple procedure, just torquing some bolts. However, there are a couple of places you would want to use some RTV. In these corners here, where the gaskets for the front and the rear covers mate up to the bottom of the block, just a little bit of RTV right over those in those corners will help. Not a ton, just a really thin smear, just enough to close these gaps up. That's all you need. So I'm going to do that quick, and then I'll be ready to start torquing down some bolts. Okay, time for the gasket. These gaskets are exactly the same whether you've got front sump, rear sump, doesn't matter. Same across all LS engines. Alright, what can help get everything lined up is if you get one bolt started in a hole and line one corner up, and just get the corners lined up by using a bolt and fit it into the hole on the gasket. That, and there you go. That just helps to get everything oriented. Other thing you need to pay attention to is that the holes for the oil pan are not the same on both sides. There's 5 on each side, but they're in different positions. So on this side there's one way the heck back here, but then on this side it's further forward. In total, you're going to have 14 bolts, 12 of the short ones and the 2 long ones in the back. So just make sure when you're done, you can count around, and you're going to have 14 total. Now when you're torquing these down, I like to torque them down just like a cylinder head. So start in the middle and then do a continuous crisscross pattern. It just helps to spread the gasket out evenly and give you the best possible seal. So if you know the pattern for the cylinder head, then you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, it would kind of go something like this. 1, 2 in the middle, then 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, around like that. And then you can do the ones on the end. So these shorter bolts are all supposed to be 18 foot-pounds, just like everything else on the block pretty much. But these 2 longer ones in the very back are supposed to be 9 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do everything first to 9 foot-pounds, including the ones on the back. Then I'm going to turn the torque wrench up to 18 and finish doing the short ones. It doesn't say to do that in the service manual. I just like to do things in multiple stages when you're dealing with gaskets. I think it just helps with sealing. Okay, I'm just going to recheck those back ones that are 9 foot-pounds, because I did get another quarter turn out of everything, so we'll have compressed that gasket a little bit more. Might have loosened up these back ones. Okay, yep, those did turn a little bit more, so a good thing I did it again. So I also took the liberty of putting the knock sensors back on and the crank position sensor earlier in the day. Those also get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. So that's everything I'm going to do on this episode of the show. Next episode, we'll be completing the assembly of the engine. I'll be putting the heads on, the lifters in, the fuel system will go completely on. I'm going to measure for new push rod link, because I know I'm going to need different link push rods now. Be putting the clutch on and buttoning all of this back up, filling it with oil, and I think I'll even test fire and pre-lube it to make sure I've got oil everywhere before I put it in the car and start it up for reals. So once again, thank you very much for watching this episode of Josh's Car Corner, and we'll see you in the next one real soon.